with this always gives me trouble. So let me indicate the focus of the presentation. And so if I slip up at some point, you will actually be aware of where I am. I want to give a few, just look at the interpretations of employability and lifelong learning very briefly. Look at trends reported in some papers regarding these concepts. What has been said about the use of e-learning, ICT, distance education, in promoting lifelong learning and employability, and how can universities play a role in promoting these two concepts. I don't think I'll get to the fifth point, which is something we can look at briefly as an introduction to the actual workshop. But I will just put up some of the statements around which I will be speaking this morning. So some of them are mostly, you see? I will go to the paper, and you can follow then what I'm saying. Now, globalization and trade liberalization have led in recent times to an increase in the number of students enrolled in higher education, primarily through the proliferation of universities in many regions in the world, and particularly in Latin America and in several Arab countries in Europe. Now, this trend has increased access to higher education for many, but it has also led to a high level of competitiveness, and in the Caribbean, with which I'm most familiar, it has led to issues related to the quality of programs offered by these institutions. Some of the challenges that have arisen with respect to globalization have been mentioned in the literature. McIntosh, for example, talks about the erosion of the traditional role of governments in what he calls, and I quote, regulatory mechanisms, recognition of qualifications for certification. Van der Wende talks about national governments not being in a position to steer initiatives, nor being able to monitor the quality of particular programs or the trustworthiness of non-accredited providers. Changing patterns in the workplace can be exacerbated by the current economic situation, can exert pressure on individuals to maximize opportunities for employment. And this brings into sharp focus, once again, the importance for lifelong learning as a means of enabling workers to cope with rapidly changing demands and to survive in the labor market. Now, the concept of lifelong learning has thus become a more critical factor, which I think influences employability of individuals. So let's go on then to look at some of the interpretations, some definitions. We had the early one by Faure, and everyone is familiar with that, looked at lifelong learning as essential to the formulation of educational policies, seen as the means by which societies could be transformed, et cetera, et cetera. Then we had someone like Harris coming along and identifying three characteristics. The first one related to rationale. And in that particular discourse, the whole idea was that social capital was an important factor in the whole process of individual development. It was good for citizenship and for the good of society. Those were considered of primary importance. And then you had the focus on, you had an emphasis on focus, and that had to do with how educational context dealt with the whole issue. Dave, for example, thought that lifelong learning was considered to be a corrective measure for the existing systems of education. And it seems we've come around full circle. Here today we're talking about how educational systems can begin to look at lifelong learning in this era of economic constraint to begin to transform our societies and help people to build their own, to become more developed. Okay, and then we have a couple others. There's Smith and Sperling's definition. They associated it with the whole notion of learning from the cradle to the grave. And then you had Davies talking about the development of human potential through a supportive process which stimulates and empowers individuals to acquire knowledge, values, skills, and so on. Now, The other issue that was raised is that distinction between education and lifelong learning, which really is not such a critical idea. Some people thought that associated lifelong education with adult education, continuous education, and permanent education, which I thought a little bit restrictive. But the concept of lifelong learning hooks into the very important notion that was expressed by UNESCO some years ago, that one can learn. And learning to learn becomes a critical issue with which universities have to become important, because as a meta skill, it identifies exactly what learners need to take them through life and be able to transform and adapt to new and changing situations. So let's go on then to the concept of employability, and I'll look very quickly at one or two. Before I do that, let me just mention a few common understandings that we take from the definitions. First, I'd like to emphasize the point that learning can take place throughout life, and individuals can continue to develop skills, competencies, and refine behaviors as a result of that learning. But that is if they have that meta skill of learning how to learn. And educational systems then play a very important role in the learning and development of individuals and influence their response to actions throughout the world. But that is if educational systems can in fact supply the sorts of programs and experiences that provide learners with those particular abilities. And the last one I spoke about very briefly is the whole business of having learners adapt their behaviors, their skills to changing circumstances and being able to acquire new skills as they go along. Now quickly, to speak about employability, and you have a few there, a person's capability of gaining initial employment, maintaining employment, and so on. You've probably seen all of those before. Now the lifelong, the L-line publication speaks of the employee's ability to survive on the labor market despite its turbulence. But in a time of constraint like this, if there aren't jobs, what do learners do? What do workers do? Is something that we also need to consider. Another definition speaks about the traditional intellectual skills, the new core key skills, and the knowledge of organizations and how they work. In other words, it speaks to a learner's understanding of the working environment in which he or she which they find themselves, and that knowledge then helps them to navigate the system and apply their own skills in ways that will make their contributions valuable to the workplace and also to them. I like the one that York, working with the ESECT group out of England, speaks of. They speak of, it has become the working definition for ESECT, a set of achievements, skills, understandings, and personal attributes that make graduates more likely to gain employment and be successful in their chosen occupation. Now, we note the distinction, and we have to remember it, between employment and employability. Employability refers to the ability to adapt, to begin to learn new skills, and so on. Employment is the end result. If you have those skills, then you can get employed by somebody. Now, what I tried to do was to look at trends between lifelong learning, employability, and education in the literature, and I came up with the OECD indicators, Education at a Glance, for 2008, a comparable search for other countries in the world, the so-called less developed and developing countries, did not yield much data. And in fact, one of the criticisms was that there just isn't that data, and the only educational indicator that could be used to compare the two sets of countries was that of literacy. So again, like the oft referred to digital divide, we are, when we look at those documents, seeing again a disparity between the countries. And as the richer countries begin to cope better with the economic constraints, we have to question what the situation in developing countries is going to be like. And if in any way education can help people to pull out of that situation, I found the keynote speakers' comments very interesting in that regard. Some of the general findings from the ILO report that productivity levels in the OECD countries were significantly higher than in developing countries in the 2 years that they compared this, 1996 and 2006. They also found that productivity in high-income OECD countries were 4 times higher than productivity in developing countries, and nearly 18 times higher than in least developed countries. Using literacy as the indicator, they found, and I quote, as the share of the population above the age of 15, using literacy, which was the most widely indicator, they found that the share of the population above age 15 were able to read and write. And they found that literacy is nearly universal in the OECD and CEE countries. On the contrary, only half the population in the LDCs, the least developed countries, is literate, and literacy rates are even lower for women. It's a very important indicator. Now, can education systems change this? What can universities in particular do to change this? I think these are questions that we need to concern ourselves with at this meeting. Some other important, I've gone through this. This quotation about the trends in LDCs and their implications. I'll look at the trends and the implications. So across all countries, women are overrepresented in the informal economy, which implies greater job security, as well as lack of access to training, social protection, and other resources. These make women comparatively more vulnerable to poverty and marginalization. And they spoke specifically about developing countries like Asia, the Pacific, Latin America. 2 of the main challenges are meeting the demand for higher skills in the growing technology, often export-oriented sectors. And in Latin America, there is some concern that while coverage of education and training has increased, the quality of that education has not equipped young people for the labor market. And again, we seem not to be paying attention to the new skills that young learners have, their orientation so easily to the technology. And if we continue to teach in traditional ways only, are we then marginalizing them by our very efforts to educate them? So these are questions that we have to consider, and it has a strong implication for how we teach and also as well as what we teach. Now, there were 2 specific recommendations made in respect of developing and less developed countries, and these are worth noting. I have them right here. That one was the improvement of coordination between prospective employers and education and training providers. And they thought that this was one way of reducing the mismatch between education and training outcomes and employment opportunities. And I think, by implication, the employability of those people who are seeking work. And the second one was encouraging workplace learning. Traditionally, universities have not gone fully, except for the social sciences, the business, management, and so on. They have not gone fully for internships, or in education, you have teaching practice. But are there ways in which universities can begin to work with employers to understand what is happening in that changing world, to begin to actually factor into their own curriculum the sorts of learning and experiences that will provide learners with the ability to transform when they get and to adapt quickly to the market so that they can begin to transform their own skills. There is a lot that has happened in the technical and vocational sector in all of the, especially in the OECD countries, but more recently in Latin America, Africa, and in the Caribbean, and that's making a change in the workforce, helping people, young people, to actually get jobs. But there is a disconnect somehow and often between what those institutions do and universities' willingness to take graduates from those particular areas. So the whole business of productivity and growth, productivity, employability, these become critical issues for educational institutions. What the ILO report found was that productivity, growth, and rising education levels in the labor force have been associated with faster employment growth. Now, that is a very important indicator. And they noted, that education, training, and lifelong learning foster, and I'm quoting, a virtuous circle of higher productivity, more employment, of better quality, income growth, and development. And the findings out of that OECD report seem to bear out this particular statement very clearly. Let me show you one or two of the things that have been found with respect to the OECD countries, the trends. Look at, I've just pulled out about two. Look at what they're saying. The people with low educational attainment are both less likely to be labor force participants, more likely to be unemployed. Differences in employment rates between males and females are wider among less educational groups. And then differences in unemployment rates for male and females generally decrease with higher levels of educational attainment. What does this say about our thrust to have people better educated and to have more education? I think it is very critical that these indicators, which reflect some of the successes within the OECD countries, become important for us to take on in our discussions here. One of the comments from that study was that people would benefit from what they say are the new opportunities offered by ICTs for traditional jobs, self-employment, and new professions. And the assertion that awareness and literacy in ICTs are essential throw us directly into the whole arena of how we employ these in distance learning. Distance learning has been around for a long time. In the university in which I teach, we've had extramural departments moving into schools of continuing studies, offering, for example, classes face-to-face. We now have 42 sites distributed across the Caribbean, and in order to try and transform itself, the university has created, in addition to 3 traditional campuses that are very difficult to change or do anything differently, it has gone outside of that particular context to create what it calls an open campus to provide distance education through online and e-learning capabilities in order to reach the vast number of people in the underserved communities who have been crying out for education for years. This is an experiment 1.5 years in the making. Whether it succeeds is a good test as to whether, in fact, universities using distance education and being flexible in terms of how it introduces people to higher education will work. So what are some of the things that might be considered as we try to introduce people to higher education? Some people talk about recognition of prior learning. So that takes on work experience as well as any other learning one has had before. Our universities open enough to look at those particular kinds of experiences and qualifications and take people from where they are and provide them with the kinds of programs that will then make higher learning accessible to them without really lowering quality. It's an important thing. I think through distance education, through the online learning capabilities, that can happen. One of the experiments associated with the university, I'm speaking about the open campus, is that you take them where you are with the prior learning, and you provide programs for them through laddered programs that take them where they are and provide them with the kinds of learning experiences that they need, including the meta skill of learning how to learn so they become independent learners. And through that laddered process, you really get them ready for the kinds of degree programs that they need to take. But then there's also the issue as to how, when they get to the established universities, they can begin to fall into that particular regime and then continue towards employability and so on. If we don't look at what's happening in the traditional realm, then, and we teach people as we have been used to teaching them, I think we're going to experience exactly what has been experienced in the Caribbean, a very high dropout in the number of males from education. And why? Because they don't find it relevant and because the methods that we teach don't seem to engage them. And that's why all of the things that were mentioned this morning, like Twitter, like the mobile phones, like the computer, they seem more engaged when we involve them in interactive learning through these methodologies. And I think universities have to begin to see how they can infuse ICTs and those kinds of supports into the curriculum to make learning meaningful for people. The literature emphasizes the point that new learning technologies, in fact, can provide the means through which people can improve core lifelong learning skills and acquire the additional competencies that they may require for purposes of employability. Now, the point has been made that in these uncertain times in which information and communications technology is developing rapidly, universities need to, and I quote, let's get here a bit. You'll get that, so I'm not going to go into it, but the World Summit had a number of very positive statements to make about ICTs and the contribution of ICTs to continuous and adult education, retraining, lifelong learning, distance learning, and these can, in fact, influence employability. They talked about ICTs contributing to the achievement of universal education worldwide. The whole business of equity as it relates to that digital divide of which I spoke, as it relates to the developmental gaps that exist in the world, that gap can only become wider in this time of economic constraint if the developing countries cannot find ways of working with the lack that they now have and really helping to build human resources. That divide is even going to grow wider. Flexibility and availability of e-learning makes it ideal for organizations to promote learning opportunities and so on. So the literature is replete with a lot of those things. Now, I spoke about the use of recognition of prior learning, and there is need also, we understand, for a wide range of materials and courses for training individuals for the labor market within universities to make them maintain employability within the market. The whole idea of maintenance of employability is something that has to happen within the context of lifelong learning. How can universities do this? Well, I think that we can make a contribution by maximizing on the delivery of services through training of trainers and teachers. In other words, you train the trainers, the teachers, they can go out and train others in the use of e-learning approaches and other modalities, which will facilitate the meta-learning skill as well as delivery and independent learning. The very important point that the skill of learning underpins all employability skills forces us to focus on learning to learn as a foundation for addressing employability and to equip learners with the skills to maintain vocational competence and to build on their educational background. So some of the things, and I'll just leave this, that universities can do: reconsider the development and assessment of graduates and their attributes from the perspective of lifelong learning. And these authors talk about a holistic approach. 2 attributes: embedding employability into the curriculum, which is one of the other things that I mentioned, which suggests that it will help learners construct understandings of the subject matter and maintain interest in developing skillful practices. But in addition to that, we have to think of how we can also embed in our methodologies and use of the technology for actually helping us to reach those particular ends. I'd like to just end off by saying that the development of the developmental distance between the OECD countries and the rest of the world, among other things, which leads to the digital divide, the differences in development, calls for institutions of higher learning like the universities, especially in the developing countries, to find innovative ways of building valuable human resources. How they do that is a question that we have to which we have to turn our attention. And I think that the network of institutions that are represented here will provide us with the opportunities for learning about best practices and forging collaborative links that might narrow that divide. I'd like to suggest, too, that we consider all of those pre-university abilities that learners have and which universities might begin to consider and form a way of using those as an entree for students to begin to access higher education and to let that be an education of quality. Thank you.